What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and in this video, I'm going to show you how the Scream movies subliminally give away the identities of the killers at the start of each film, and how you'll be able to use that information to accurately guess who the killers will be in any and all future Scream installments. For any successful whodunit murder mystery, the first step in understanding how it's even possible to pick the killer out from a crowd is to recognize that it will be the intention of the filmmakers to unconsciously clue us in on their identity. This is done using what I'm going to refer to as a predictive killer edit, and it can be found across all 5 of the current Scream movies, with every character who has ever turned out to be the killer. The concept of this edit is based on the idea that everything that is ultimately said and shown to us on screen must serve some sort of editorial purpose in establishing a narrative that satisfies the eventual killer's unmasking. The reason for this is because as an audience, we need to be psychologically conditioned to accept the truth, so that by the time all is revealed to us in the end, we won't be left scratching our heads, wondering how it was even possible that person X could have been the killer all along. Therefore, by observing the story arc of each individual character, we should be able to determine who the killer is going to be early on, by recognizing their role within the context of the plot. However, we're literally going to have to examine every character in order to do this, except for obviously the ones who don't survive the opening scene, as the saying "everybody's a suspect" definitely rings true here. Now, when it comes to what clues we need to be looking out for, this is where things may get a little tricky, since based on the 9 killers from the franchise thus far, we should know that not every single one of their edits has been exactly alike, as each killer for the most part has a very unique story. With that said, the main criteria we'll need to start off with is to identify which character type each one of the killers are. That way, we can sort them accordingly based on specific trends and patterns that have carried over from movie to movie. Based on my own research, I've broken these character types down into 7 distinct categories, which from here on out will be classified separately as the hero, the confidant, the devil's advocate, the apathetic friend, hidden in plain sight, the wild card, and the red herring. Every character in the franchise should fall under one of these categories, regardless of whether they turn out to be the killer or not. So it's up to us to distinguish which type best fits their role, which in most cases we should be able to have a pretty good understanding of by the end of the first act. From there, we can compare the differences in the character edits between the killers and the non-killers to identify exactly what it is that gives away their reveal. However, I should note that while the first 6 character types do possess complexities that may unveil a path towards their villainous turn, I can guarantee you that the red herring will never be the killer. To clarify, I'm not saying that every red herring should automatically be classified as a red herring type, but it's going to be important to distinguish these people apart from the real threats, as this will be one of the easiest ways to rule out a suspect. In order to recognize the red herring, we need to pay close attention to their story. If the entirety of a character's complex history is told to us through third-party sources, usually very early in the movie, and in a lot of cases before we're even introduced to them in person, it offers very little room for development later on down the road. They also tend to be presented in a very over-the-top negative tone, which leaves them with the one and only personality trait of being suspicious. We may see them pop up from time to time, but you'll notice that with each appearance, we never learn any new information about them, as all of their dialogue is only made to further support their questionable guilt. That's not to say that the eventual killer will be completely free of blame by the time they're revealed, but if their motive has been forcibly spoon-fed to us throughout the movie, you can guarantee that the audience will find this killer to be an unsuccessful twist, given that the true surprise of any killer reveal is actually the why, rather than the who. Prime examples of the red herring are Neil Prescott in Scream 1, Cotton Weary in Scream 2, John Milton in Scream 3, Trevor Sheldon in Scream 4, and Vince Schneider in Scream 5. I thought about classifying Scream 1 Neil Prescott as a hidden in plain sight character instead, as his limited visibility does prevent his tone from coming off as over-the-top negative. However, just because he isn't afforded the opportunity to cast doubt on his own character like the others do, it doesn't doesn't necessarily mean that the conversations surrounding him aren't already doing a sufficient enough job of this as it is. On the same token, John Milton could also be considered a hidden in plain sight character, just given how under the radar he's presented in the first act of Scream 3. But I think that any instance of a major shift in a character's visibility partway through the movie needs to at least be taken into consideration, since if that character doesn't end up dead immediately following this sudden boost in exposure, it might suggest they could still end up playing a pivotal role. I'll touch upon that more when we get to the hidden in plain sight character types. However, it is important to note that Cotton's story arc in Scream 2 is a lot more complex than the other red herrings, as there's a duality to his motivation that could suggest a drive for either fame or revenge. That still wouldn't make his motive feel any less redundant if he did turn out to be the killer, but this could also be considered a thematic clue that points towards the identities of the film's true villains, since both threads perfectly represent Mickey's desire for fame, as well as Mrs. Loomis's need to avenge the death of Billy. In that regard, the red herring will be an important figure to look out for, as their story might indirectly be a reference to the killer's motive, even though they don't happen to be the killer themselves. For the next character type, the hero, this is obviously going to be the main character. However, I'll elaborate on this more by designating this type to anyone who is the central figure behind any driving storyline. These characters are usually at the forefront of almost every scene, with the exception of course being any isolated murder, and you won't be able to identify this killer by their tone, as they'll most likely be presented in a positive light, regardless of where they ultimately land. Since the first 4 movies are essentially her story from beginning to end, Sidney Prescott is the most prominent figure who will take up this character type, but I'd also categorize her as being one in Scream 5, since she does display the agency needed to take control of the narrative by the time she arrives on the scene. Also, despite being somewhat of an antagonist and having a very under-the-radar introduction in the original film, Gale Weathers falls under this type as well, as she actively pushes the plot forward through an engaging B storyline. This is a pattern we see continue over the course of the next 3 sequels. However, she takes on more of a supporting role in the 5th film, which I'll explain more about when we discuss the role of the Confidante. Other than that, Jill Roberts assumes this role in Scream 4 in respect to being the central figure of the new generation cast, and then Sam Carpenter will fall under this character type as well, since she's obviously presented as being the main driving force behind Scream 5. Now, I know this is a hot debate amongst a small percentage of Scream fans, so I'll just get this out of the way now. Historically, no returning character has ever turned out to be the killer, as each new Ghostface has been exclusive to the chapter in which they are revealed. That's not to say that it can't happen in a future installment, but in terms of all of the characters who've made multiple sequel appearances so far, there has never been any inconsistencies in their tone, as each new chapter extends a trajectory that is complemented by their pre-established character arcs. This is why, despite endless speculation, they will most likely never be the killers. If they are, and that's a big if, their character will need to be presented with some sort of tonal or behavioral contradiction. Otherwise, this twist will be criticized for being thrown at us from completely out of the blue. However, if we are meeting the hero for the very first time, you will be able to tell if they are the killer based on empathy and cognitive reasoning. To put this in simpler terms, let's compare Sidney's character arc in Scream 1 to Jill's character arc in Scream 4. While we're introduced to Sidney at the top of the first act, where her relationship with Billy informs us of her insecurities, already presenting a complex heroine, Jill is actually the 6th character we meet after the title card in Scream 4. Even worse, she doesn't get to start off her own scene, as she's instead introduced into the movie through Kirby's perspective. This should immediately tell us that this is at least not Jill's story as a final girl, despite the fact that all of the dialogue we hear from the other characters is centered around her. This also presents her as a character who is solely defined by her relationship with her ex-boyfriend, as well as her relationship to her cousin, which may present a lot of detail on the surface, but on a sub-level doesn't tell us anything about her emotionally or psychologically. Conversely, during Sidney's journey through Scream 1's first act, there are many allusions made to her mother's murder the previous year. However, nobody ever comes right out and says it, and we're left to watch Sidney quietly reflect on this tragedy in relation to the current string of murders, which puts us directly in her experience, allowing allowing us to develop empathy for her character. Jill, on the other hand, is never afforded any of these private moments. In fact, there's almost never a scene that goes by where she isn't interacting with another character. The phone call she receives from Charlie is answered in front of two of her friends, giving it a very impersonal tone, and she constantly glides in and out of the picture, leaving our focus instead on the emotional responses of the other characters who've been influenced by her. That alone should be the biggest giveaway if this character type is the killer, because they've been able to manipulate everyone else around them to not only perceive their emotions in a way that they want them to, but also do all of their expressing for them. This is how Scream 4 fools us, because everything we learn about Jill is gleaned through the way she postures herself. The purpose of the supporting characters should be to inform us of who Jill is by way of push and pull, and here what they do instead is exposit on her behalf, creating an emotional detachment in the way we experience her story. When we examine these traits in relation to Gale and Sam, we can see that these are characters who, like Sydney, are given dimension through the way in which they challenge and overcome obstacles. Over the course of the first 4 films, we're constantly discovering new layers to Gale based on the way the other characters push up against her, and we always get to hear her explain her actions, no matter how unscrupulous her motivations may be. With Sam, we're introduced to a character who, although may be presented with an ambiguously fragile psyche, still gets to offer us her perspective, which ultimately allows the viewer to access and understand her complex emotions. In that regard, these characters not only get to show us how they're feeling, but they also dictate the course of the movie through the choices they make in response to it. With that said, if you find that you're not connecting with this character type on an empathetic level, and it just seems like they're reacting to the movie that's happening to them, it won't matter what the exposition and backstory tells us otherwise, because this character is purposefully being left as a blank canvas so that they can later on be filled in with rich and villainous brushstrokes. When it comes to the Confidant, this will be the character type who is directly linked to the movie's hero. And although they may ruffle the hero's feathers a bit, they'll never actually knock them off course, since if they do turn out to be the killer, it's an important part of their plan to allow for the hero to always feel in control. There may be more than one character per movie who acts as a confidant, but they'll usually have a much larger role than most of the other suspects, as they're shown to either have a strong relationship with the hero or could develop one over the course of the movie if they've just met them for the first time. Based on the current killers, the two who fall under this category are Billy Loomis and Richie Kirsch. Of course, I could have easily just called this one the boyfriend character type, however, it doesn't have to be relegated to just the love interest. Other characters who would fall under this type are Hallie and Derek, Kirby in relation to Jill, and Tara and Wes in relation to Sam. Characters from Scream 3 are a little harder to pinpoint since the majority of them have little to no association with either of the film's heroes, but I would classify Kincaid under this type as well, since there is a lot of focus put onto his shared storyline with Sydney, especially in regards to her character arc of overcoming trauma. We can classify Dewey as a confidant as well, since despite David Arquette having headlined every Scream movie to date, his character has always been presented in a supporting capacity, hence the reason why we don't classify him as a hero type. He obviously does receive a lot of focus, where we even get to see his perspective, but he's still always shown to follow someone else's lead. For example, if Scream 4 was framed as a police investigation, he would be at the center of the movie, but since that storyline becomes more about Gale going rogue, he's forced to react to her moves rather than make his own. He does, however, border on being a hidden in plain sight character in the original Scream, just because of his limited visibility in the first act, but we do get enough personal content from him later on that it does boost his relevancy to the plot. Also, as I had mentioned previously with Gale, she takes on a confidant role in Scream 5, since despite her presence as a legacy character who receives the expected formal treatment, we don't ever see her sitting in the metaphorical driver's seat, as her participation is hinged entirely on Sam and Sydney's influence. Now, if repeating patterns were to ever be an indicator for what to predict, it's worth mentioning that historically, both of our current confidant killers have been introduced alongside our leads at the beginning of the first act, which does make sense given that they'd require the optimal amount of screen time in order to accommodate all of their shared personal content. Of course, this could always change in future sequels, so it's not a surefire metric to follow, but we can also gauge when this character won't be the killer, since Hallie also follows this same pattern, as she's the confidant who's introduced introduced alongside Sidney in Scream 2. You'll be able to easily track this character's relationship with the film's central figure, as their first few lines of dialogue will often reveal to us what their mutual story thread will be. For instance, Hallie expresses a desire to get into the Delta Lambda sorority and makes it a point to have Sidney accompany her to the martini mixer that night, much to Sidney's chagrin. Later on in the quad, it's revealed that the reason Hallie has recruited Sidney to pledge with her is because it will put her in better standing with Lois and Murphy, implying that Hallie has a manipulative streak, which would certainly present a red flag indicating her as a possible killer. However, this entire plot thread appears to get resolved by the end of the first act, when Sidney not only announces that she won't be joining the sorority, but also because she and Hallie completely redirect their priorities as a result of the attack. This subconsciously lets the viewer know that the Delta Lambda storyline was never meant to be part of a complex overarching narrative, and since this was the crux of her relationship to Sidney, it basically tells us that Hallie will no longer be crucial to the plot, most likely meaning she's not the killer. With that in mind, you're gonna want to focus on the confidants who do possess a complex overarching narrative with the hero, which you'll be able to recognize in the way that the relationship becomes more complicated with every new scene that they appear together in. This could present itself in the form of an underlying issue that manifests into a greater conflict, or the revelation of a backstory that wasn't immediately made aware to us from the start. Once you've identified that, you can start to weed out additional characters like Wes, since despite having a known history with Sam, we don't learn anything new about their friendship, and by the time they're all grouped together to discuss theories, the two don't even share a single verbal exchange. That's not to suggest that there isn't a close bond between them, as Sam appears to be affected by his death later on, but we only ever get to see her side of their connection, meaning that his perspective isn't going to be relevant to the overall plot. With that said, if this character is entirely defined by their relationship to the hero and continuously hits the same beat in all of their scenes, we can deduce that they're not actually the killer, but rather a prop whose purpose within the story is solely to serve as a lesson that the hero will need to learn. However, if the confidant is going to be the killer, we need to at least be shown that in whatever way they are connected to the hero, they each need to be portrayed as having a completely autonomous role in that relationship. That way, their storyline can splinter off into several different plot threads, which in turn will offer much more potential for a hidden motive to be revealed later on down the line. In that regard, rather than be defined by their relationship to the hero, the killer will instead be defined in spite of it. The other thing you'll want to look out for is an inconsistent tone and character, meaning that the movie will often go back and forth on portraying the killer in a positive and negative light. This can be picked up on in little nuances like how the other characters perceive and react to the individual in question, and even punctuated by the film's score with specific musical cues that accompany their appearance on screen. Characters who are consistently presented in a positive light will rarely, if ever, be revealed as the killer, as their ability to be trusted and loved by both the hero and audience alike will often cast them in higher standing as fan favorites. That's not to say that we don't love our killers as well, but there are going to be noticeable inflections in their words and actions, which will often be revealed when you contrast how they conduct themselves a certain way with one character, only to conduct themselves a dramatically different way when it comes to another. They may also take on a pendulum effect, where there will be a subtle alternating shift in tone from one scene to the next, which will most likely reveal itself in a character's actions contradicting their words. Also, I should mention that insulting a legacy character is never a good look for anyone, and unless it's done to set up a joke or some other lighthearted moment, it will definitely be a major red flag one should look out for. In that regard, the confidant can still be portrayed as an independent character while also sharing a complex overarching narrative with the hero, but if they're consistent in their tone and their actions match their words, you can definitely be assured that they will not be your killer. Up next is the Devil's Advocate, which similarly to the confidant will be a supporting character who is closely linked to one of our heroes. However, the key difference with this character type can be identified by their contentious agenda. What I mean by this is that these are the supporting characters who are not only going to to be extremely outspoken in their convictions, but will also stir the pot by instilling these ideas in the minds of the other characters. That doesn't automatically mean that they're a snaky person, however, as on the more altruistic end of that spectrum, this could be someone who is just overly protective of our hero and takes a dominant role in ensuring their well-being. On the more selfish side of things, this could be a character who uses their influence to argue the merits of self-preservation or plant seeds of mistrust in order to either turn the hero against another character or to turn another character against the hero if they're attempting to usurp their position. Based on the current killers, the two who fall under this category are Mickey Altieri and Amber Freeman. However, other characters who meet this criteria are Randy Meeks, Tatum Riley, Joel Jones, Jennifer Jolie, Olivia Morris, Judy Hicks, and Mindy Meeks. Given the effusive nature of this character, I wouldn't expect the movie to present them with any sort of complex, overarching narrative, as their relationship to or with the hero can most likely be taken at face value, meaning that what you see is what you get. Based on that, you might be able to uncover this killer by looking out for visual clues. However, since the devil's advocate is defined by having other people's best interests at heart, it's going to be a lot easier to figure out when they're being disingenuous, as for the most part, we can once again use the methodology of looking for an inconsistent tone in character. For instance, they can theorize suspects and throw shade on the other characters, but if it isn't done for personal gain and rather in the service of educating others, the optics will remain very positive. Also, despite pushing up against our heroes, the characters who challenge the status quo by prioritizing their own survival will typically be cast in a positive light as well, seeing as how they're operating under a rational mindset. That's not to suggest that the killer would never propose the idea of getting the hell out of Dodge, but if this has unwaveringly been the stance of this character for multiple scenes, it's unlikely they'll be the killer, as there won't be any glaring contradictions that would present any major shift in tone. In other cases, a neutral tone which is neither positive or negative could also rule out a suspect, as Olivia in Scream 4 spends most of her limited screen time touting the line that Sydney is the angel of death. While this is a very anti-Sydney sentiment, it does showcase Olivia's pragmatic nature, as she believes her survival hinges on keeping a safe distance. However, as we know historically that Sydney has never been the direct cause of any innocent person's death, this instead displays Olivia's ignorance towards the fact that Sydney is a survivor by her own tenacity. Since Olivia doesn't waver from this opinion and even displays unease over being physically present in the same room as Sydney, it not only tells us that she won't be the killer, but will also most likely receive a very karmic death, simply for having a jarringly incorrect read on our hero. When it comes to the devil's advocate types who are cast as being in direct opposition with our heroes, we can once again observe the longevity of their storylines to get a better grasp on their overall relevance. For instance, Jennifer starts out in Scream 3 by planting a major wedge between Gale and Dewey. However, this dilemma is resolved partway through the movie when Dewey clearly makes a choice between the two, and similar to Hallie, Jennifer is left to ride out her remaining screen time as a sidekick until she ultimately meets an untimely demise. Judy also fills a similar role to this in Scream 4, and even though she has attributes of red herring and hidden in plain sight, her conflict with Gale is presented as being the main foundation of her character. Admittedly, Judy is a hard suspect to pin down, as Gale and Dewey's storyline resolution doesn't come until way later on. But I think that in a case like this, where a character is presented as having too many loose threads, it's probably safe to rule them out, as their eventual motive as the killer could come off as being a little too haphazard. In that regard, less might be more when it comes to this killer, since as I mentioned before, the movie won't need to waste too much time diving into any superficial conflict, as a simple visual clue such as a disdainful leer will be sufficient enough in letting us know where this character stands. Because of that, you can probably expect them to never openly confront their target, as it's more in the style of the devil's advocate to work their manipulative angle from behind the scenes. It'll also be important to pay attention to what they're saying about the hero. The story itself may very well be true, but if it's tonally inconsistent with the way the hero has been presented thus far, it's a surefire bet that this person is gaslighting everyone in an attempt to arouse suspicion and frame that person as the killer. Similarly to that, if this character type is aligned with the hero, make sure to pay close attention for any tonal irregularities between what they're saying and who they're saying it about. For instance, Tatum's main objective in the story is to shine light on the aspects of Billy's character that he's trying to keep hidden. Since Billy has already given Sydney, and by extension the viewer, every reason to doubt him, Tatum represents that voice of reason that we all subconsciously know to be true. Therefore, her tone in the movie can only be considered a positive one, meaning that it's very unlikely that she would turn out to be the killer. Conversely, when Mickey attempts to do the same thing with Sydney in regards to Derek, nothing shown to her or us at that point would suggest there ever was any reason to cast doubt on Derek's perceived innocence. Sydney's connection to Mickey is also presented as being her least defined relationship to any of the ancillary characters in her friend group, which only further makes their one-on-one feel out of place. This doesn't necessarily make Mickey look bad, especially since his outward tone with all of the other characters is mostly positive, but it does tell us that he could either be manipulating her as he knows she has crippling trust issues, or he simply just has a really bad read on Derek. However, given the fact that Mickey's attitude towards Derek jumps back to being positive in his next scene, it definitely presents a discrepancy in his outlook, which is a major red flag indicating him as the killer. Mickey also carries around a camcorder, which seems to draw even more attention in the cafeteria scene when you notice his lack of a lunch tray in contrast to everyone else. This doesn't necessarily prove anything just yet, but it lets us know that we should always be looking to see what the characters are doing or holding on to, just in case the answer turns up right under our noses later on. Similarly, Amber calls attention to Chad's bruises, insinuating he could be the killer. As Amber herself displays bruising along her collarbone, this lets us know that anytime a character calls attention to a specific detail, it's worth doing a reverse observation of the accuser, as it's possible they could be projecting their own guilt as the killer. When it comes to the apathetic friend, these are the characters who are mostly defined by their passive indifference, which will reveal itself in either an outward lack of sympathy for the victims of the killer or just a very cavalier attitude in regard to their own personal safety. Despite some of them being presented as comic relief characters, they'll almost always have a negative tone throughout the movie, so you won't be able to use that as a metric to gauge whether or not they'll be the killer. However, if they're not the killer, they will typically be nothing more than a future victim themselves, as this character is usually predestined to being nothing more than cannon fodder. You can typically find them cracking jokes about the deceased, attending social gatherings despite there being a maniac on the loose, or just being generally insensitive or unaware of the turmoil the hero has gone through or is currently in the middle of. Out of the current killers, both Stu Macher and Charlie Walker fall under this category, but other characters who meet the apathetic friend criteria are Tyson Fox, Tom Prince, and Sarah Darling of the Stab 3 cast, Rebecca Walters and Robbie Mercer in Scream 4, and Chad Meeks and Liv McKenzie in Scream 5. Personally, even though I find the positively toned Chad to be very likable, this is my least favorite character type, since these are probably the most cartoonish and unrealistic characters that could exist in the Scream universe. I do, however, think that Stu works as an exception to that statement because Matthew Lillard's performance is so incredibly nuanced that you could very well link his behavior to any number of personality disorders. But otherwise, there's not a whole lot of depth to mine from any of the other apathetic friends. Because of that, the biggest giveaway for this character being the killer is going to be a boastful attitude and excessive level of admiration for all things related to the murders. For instance, both Stu and Charlie possess an almost childlike delight whenever they speak about what the killer is doing, or in the way they revel in the chaos around them that they've secretly created. This can especially be seen in the way that Stu dispassionately explains how someone gutted his ex-girlfriend, and in the way Charlie telegraphs how the killer will innovate their modus operandi by filming their murders before uploading them to the internet. For most of the other characters under this type, you can easily rule them out based on their personal motivations. As an example, Robbie and Rebecca are both shown to capitalize off of the tragedy in their own selfish ways, but they reveal to us early on what their primary objectives are, in this case Rebecca's insatiable greed and Robbie's preoccupation with his live streaming website. Remember, the killer killer will never explicitly show us their hand too soon, so any clear indication of a motive should automatically write that character off. Also, just like any musical cue that alerts us to a character being suspicious, we can also apply that same methodology to the film's score when we're presented with a more playful arrangement, usually denoting a character as being too bumbling or over-the-top goofy to ever be your killer. When it comes to Chad, it was a difficult decision to place him in this category, because I think the only thing that's keeping him from being classified as a more developed character type is really his lack of any sort of shared screen time with Tara. We do see a tenuous connection between him and Sam, where he even gets to explain his history with her in a positive light, but as far as the story would have us believe, he's in Tara's friend group, and therefore should be much closer with her than how he appears. Yet, despite a quick visit to her hospital room where we don't even see any character interaction, his outward disposition regarding her attack comes off as being very nonchalant, as his priorities are more intertwined in his relationship with Liv. I do think this will be course corrected with Scream 6, where we might get to see him upgraded to a confidant character type, so similar to Gale being downgraded from a hero, this should let us know that if a survivor does return for a future sequel, it doesn't automatically mean they'll remain as the same character type. Just something to keep in mind. Our next category, which is the hidden in plain sight characters, will basically comprise of everyone in the movie who doesn't fall under one of the character types I've already gone over. And as you probably could have guessed, these are the people who are more or less invisible throughout the story, or at least will fly in under the radar to the point where you won't even remember that they're even there. Because of that, there's way too many to list individually, but to sum it up, these will be your absentee parents, your school students and faculty, members of the press, bodyguards, Carrie Fisher, or any law enforcement official that basically just shows up to do their job and nothing more. In other words, the inclusion of the hidden in plain sight character is to be expected because these are the glorified background extras who give additional life to the movie. At their most prominent, they might become the spectacle of an elaborate death set piece, and on the lesser end, they might just offer some tedious exposition to move our heroes from point A to point B. For that reason, it is extremely unlikely that this character type will be your killer. However, it's not entirely impossible, since Mrs. Loomis is currently the only Ghostface who meets this criteria. As we don't have another killer to compare her to at this point, we can't really base any of this off of repeating patterns and trends, but we can at least examine the traits of Mrs. Loomis in relation to the rest of the peripheral characters to see if there are any particular tells that give away her identity as the killer. First of all, and most importantly, we should learn this person's name when they're first introduced into the film, even if it's a fake name. Most hidden in plain sight characters don't even get a name reveal until way later on in the movie, so it's going to be important that we have this information up front. You can also rule out any character who was introduced after the first act, as this would be way too late in the film's runtime to have your killer make their first appearance. Therefore, if they are the killer, I would expect to meet them in the same stretch of establishing scenes where all of the other key characters are introduced. Since this killer would be concealing their identity, I also wouldn't expect the film to reveal any personal content about them. Therefore, most of their dialogue will be tied to the made-up reason for them being there, or used to bolster our hero by filling us in on historical details that are relevant to the current plot. For instance, Mrs. Loomis mentions that she had previously attended Gale's seminar the year prior, to which Gale confirms by saying that she thought she looked familiar. Whether Gale was just saying this to be polite or actually remembered seeing her, this absolutely sets Mrs. Loomis apart from the other hidden in plain sights, as it's an important factual detail that paints her as a person of interest. You should also listen for this character type bringing up distinct keywords that have already been mentioned by other more prominent characters. Specifically, Mrs. Loomis questions Gale about her stance on violence in cinema, which which incidentally was an argument that Mickey had championed in film class. It's a very subtle detail, but the only two characters in Scream 2 who incite this debate happen to be the villains of the story, which makes sense with what we learn later on, as Mrs. Loomis would need to push Mickey's motive if she plans on framing him as the movie's sole killer. I also noticed a subtle depreciation in Mrs. Loomis's tone throughout the movie, where she starts off positive in contrast to Gale's ruthless demeanor and acerbic remarks towards her, only to be presented increasingly more negative, while Gale's tone, on the other hand, appreciates more over the course of her redemption arc. They spend the entire movie circling around one another, where both women are consistent in their characterization, but by the time Gale finds her equilibrium following Randy's death, Mrs. Loomis appears to be nothing more than the annoying reporter that Gale had initially pegged her as, showing us that their tonal polarities have now completely switched places. Like I had also mentioned with characters such as Milton in Scream 3, and even Gale and Dewey in the original, a hidden in plain sight character could always emerge as a more prominent figure in the second act, in which case you'll need to reevaluate which category they belong in. However, I would still say that if anyone is mostly invisible during the first act, has limited to no interaction with any of the other characters, and doesn't even receive more than 1 or 2 lines of dialogue, you can definitely be sure that they will not be the killer, as this wouldn't have allowed them to make enough of an impression on the audience to qualify as a satisfying reveal by the end of the movie. When it comes to our final category, the wild card, I need to preface this one by explaining that it's going to be extremely rare for a character to actually be classified under this type, since this is more so a result of production meddling that will see the screenplay undergoing a hasty rewrite at the last minute. Because of that, the filmmakers simply won't be afforded enough time to recalibrate and fine-tune this character's trajectory, leaving them to either feel shoehorned into the action of the story or be muddled down by possessing multiple character type traits while not actually having a strong inclination towards any specific one. There are really only 3 characters in the entire franchise who fall under this type, with one of them ultimately turning out to be the killer. And if you've been keeping tabs on all of the Ghostfaces who've been mentioned thus far, you'll know that the only one we haven't covered yet is Roman Bridger. However, both Cece Cooper and Angelina Tyler will fall under this type as well, since all 3 of these characters are very unique due to the role alterations that were made during their respective film productions. By virtue of the wild card being, well, a wild card, you can expect for no 2 characters of this type to ever be alike, as there's not really a clear-cut metric to follow in terms of identifying any specific patterns and trends. Because of that, I can only really go through each one of them individually to speak to what attributes they possess that would present any sort of clue that would indicate them as being the killer or not. In the case of Cece, Sarah Michelle Gellar was only ever supposed to appear in her one scene at the sorority house, which means that similar to any opening kill, Cece's role in Scream 2 would have automatically defaulted to being nothing more than that of a victim. However, as Wes Craven wasn't satisfied with what he had originally shot for the film class scene, he invited Sarah Michelle Gellar back for several reshoots, which included having her character take part in the debate. Even though this expanded her role and introduced her into the film much earlier, there's nothing about her characterization here that suggests she could be a killer. This mostly has to do with the fact that none of her dialogue is specific to her character, and other than what brief interactions we see, she's shown to have no definable relationships to any of the film's other characters. We also don't even learn Cece's name here, but given Sarah Michelle Gellar's star power, the camera naturally gravitates towards her, making this character feel much more important than she actually is. There was another scene that was shot afterwards where Cece interacts with Lois and Murphy in the quad. However, Craven ended up cutting this as it presented a rivalry of sororities, which he felt made the character seem unsympathetic. We can still see her lingering in the background of the shot. However, this would have classified Cece as an apathetic friend, which is inconsistent with the way she's depicted in her main scene later on. Angelina is another anomaly among the characters of the franchise, since for all intents and purposes, she was written to be the second killer alongside Roman, until the studio decided mid-production that they only wanted to have one killer in Scream 3. That's why, despite the eventual changes to the plot, there are still so many clues that not only point point towards there being a second killer, but also highlight her suspicious behavior, specifically during the house explosion and then later on when Sydney is chased around the set of Stab 3. However, there's still no definable relationship between her and either Sydney or Gale, so other than the chance encounter in the restroom, her inclusion in any other scenes with them just feels incidental to the story. And while Angelina does stand out from the rest of her apathetic castmates as she displays genuine compassion over the loss of human life, she still comes off as being suspicious as she showcases a lot of behavioral inconsistencies along the way. On the other side of things, Roman's high-strung disposition consistently finds him being undermined or placated by his cast and producers, giving his character a slightly negative tone. However, unlike Angelina, he appears to have even less shared screen time with either of our heroes, as Sydney doesn't interact with him at all until the film's climax, and he's barely acknowledged by Gale when they do cross paths at Milton's office. It is worth mentioning that Roman is detained by the police for questioning, which historically has up until this point only ever happened to characters who have turned out to be the killer. I don't necessarily think that's going to be a reoccurring pattern as it's only happened twice, but if this person also dies off screen later on, it might be worth doing a double take as both he and Billy do hit these very specific beats. For the most part, I think Scream 3 is kind of a crapshoot when it comes to finding the right suspect, as the killer could have literally been anyone. But if I had to point out one thing that might give Roman away as the killer, it's the fact that he announces that he's about to turn 30. It's a minor detail, but similar to Mrs. Loomis mentioning that she attended Gale's seminar, it emphasizes a seemingly irrelevant fact about a mostly unimportant character, making them stand out as a person of interest. Realistically, unless we're dealing with a red herring, the screenwriter is not going to take up precious script real estate by telling us something that isn't going to tie into the plot. And since Roman doesn't possess the attributes of a red herring, we should take that to mean that his age and or birthday celebration is going to play an important role in the story later on. Similarly, we also find out that Angelina won the role of Sidney Prescott in Stab 3 through a talent search of 50,000 girls. This leads me to believe that this would have been the character detail that also made her a person of interest, but rather than omit this line of dialogue, they just amended it later on by adding in the revelation that she instead got the role by sleeping with Milton. Since this was Aaron Kruger's script, these hidden clues might just be a writing technique that is specific to his style, but it still highlights the importance of paying attention to the dialogue, as this could always be used as a clue to indicate the killer among the other character types as well. Having said all that, just keep in mind that hindsight is 2020, and there's nothing to say that Scream 6 won't implement brand new rules with how the story represents its characters. Because of that, I realize this guide could be obsolete by the time the movie is released, but as it stands right now, this is the only information available to us when it comes to sussing out the guilty parties. Therefore, if repeating patterns and trends do continue to remain consistent, you'll at least have a head start in narrowing down your list of suspects, making it much easier for you to uncover the killer in any and all future Scream installments. I want to thank a few of my Patreon supporters like Natalia, Tyler Plant, Marcus Connerly, Eric Champney, and Matthew Latchman. If you want to see even more Scream-related content, I recommend checking out my series on who killed who in all of the Scream movies. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.